You're listening to 3CR Radio.
David, what was the HIV/AIDS epidemic like at the time you were diagnosed in the 80s?
Well, it was very uncertain because in 1984, we'd only just started to see deaths. I mean, in America and Europe and so forth, they had some deaths from AIDS, although they weren't quite sure what was causing it at that stage. So very early days, it wasn't the level of mortality and grief, of course, that as the 80s unfolded, we had to live with.
And what kind of community organising was happening in the 80s when the epidemic was first emerging?
The AIDS Council in Victoria started in 1983, and I remember initially they didn't have anyone to look after, but it was basically to support and look after people with HIV. But also the prevention message was going to be the main work that they did for a long time until the burden of caring for people became quite high and they had to attract a lot of volunteers and get government help to, help with the nursing side of things.
What was the mood in the community like in the 80s when people started getting sick?
Oh, very scared. A lot of people, and a lot of it was just uncertain how it was transmitted. Very early on, people were saying it was people who sniffed amyl nitrate who were at risk, which of course is totally wrong. And it wasn't really realised it was sexually transmitted until 1982, 83, and so, it was very early days, and so a lot of people thought, it's not going to affect us, it's happening in America, and of course people were HIV positive in our community, and either didn't realise it or we didn't actually know what was causing them to become sick until they put a name on it. And I can't remember when HIV was actually called that. I think it was initially called human T-cell leukemia, human T-cell leukemia virus, I think, because that's what I was diagnosed with. I wasn't diagnosed with HIV because that test didn't actually come in until 1985. So, people think, shock horror, the whole thing was... But we were so uncertain and we didn't know really what was going on until scientists in America in particular, a man called Robert Gallo, and others discovered HIV and said, look, it's sexually transmitted, injecting drug use and mother to baby. So once we sort of sorted that out, we knew how to prevent it.
What was it like for you at the time when you got that diagnosis, considering all the fear and uncertainty in the community?
I suppose I was taken aback, needless to say. I had a good job and I was quite healthy, and when they did all my T-cells, I was close enough to 1,000, which is very healthy. So I wasn't overly concerned because my doctor said, and this proved to be wrong, he said, well, we think most people won't get AIDS. You'll end up 1 in 10 people will actually develop the illness. The rest of you will manage to keep it at bay, which was wrong. So for a while I lived in kind of this fool's paradise where I thought I was going to be fine and I wasn't going to get sick. But, as the 80s unfolded and my friends started to get sick, I thought, geez, how can I not eventually get sick, which of course did actually happen in 1989.
Tell us about the peer support movement for people living with HIV/AIDS and also the empowerment movement and how that evolved.
Yes, it was very big early on in America and, of course, in Europe too. It didn't happen here until a little bit later, like the late 80s. 1988 was when we first had our meeting to set up a people living with HIV group in Victoria, in Melbourne, and that was basically in response to, the ACT UP and a whole range of activist groups saying people with HIV should have a voice in this. And before that, people were too scared to say anything. They didn't want to be identified. They thought they might lose their jobs. Their family would reject them or whatever. It was a terribly scary thing for the broader society, and people were being rejected right, left and centre. It was a horrible time in terms of stigma. You know, just to say you're HIV positive was a very brave thing to do. And so we needed a group. We needed people around us who could support us, safety in numbers to some degree. And so 1988 was when we really started the people living with HIV/AIDS, as you say, peer support model.
You mentioned ACT UP. Tell us about their activities and what they were like in the 80s and 90s, especially their militancy.
Look, they were a lot of allies and, of course, a lot of positive people too, who said, we've got to do something. Governments have to provide research and get treatments happening. They need to support the AIDS Council and the care work that's needed. And it's a government health crisis. You can't just turn your back on it and say, leave it to the community, which is what they were doing, really, right up until the mid-80s. It needed that kind of level of community, street protests and politicians being mocked, whether they liked it or not. It had to happen. We had to tell politicians, this is a serious problem. You need to treat this epidemic in different ways than you have in the past. You need to respect the gay and lesbian community, which of course we'd only got the gay. It was only legal to be gay in terms of the Victorian law from 1981. And so we were sort of a burgeoning community, and we didn't have resources, we didn't have the sort of, even what you might call the credence in the community. And until AIDS came along and forced a whole lot of these issues to be discussed more broadly in the press and in community in general.
Of course, ACT UP did some great direct actions. And I remember once they were at Parliament House in Canberra and one activist famously jumped onto the floor of Parliament when Bob Hawke and Brian Howe, I think, were standing. That must have had an incredible impact on the community insofar as people saying, we're here, we're not going away, we demand that you do these things to help us in this epidemic.
And the same thing, Maureen Lister was highly embarrassed. I can't remember if it was in Parliament or Parliament steps, and she cried about it because she knew, that we were right. And she was the health minister at the time in the Victorian government. So those sort of, not that I'm saying we, James, I wasn't there, of course. No one wanted to admit they were there because some of the stuff sort of bordered on being illegal, I suppose. But I think there was compassion in the community. People realised what was being done was necessary and, did raise a lot of consciousness in the community. Some people hated us because, I suppose that sometimes personal property might have not been destroyed, but, people might have crossed a few barriers they shouldn't have, such as jumping down on the floor of Parliament.
And the floral clock.
And the floral clock, you're right. You've got a good memory, James. Yes, that's right. The floral clock was destroyed and there was such an outcry. The press was sort of, how dare these vandals attack the floral clock? And some of the politicians reacted badly as if, this was an institution or something, when, of course, the flowers, from my understanding, the people who did it had found out from the gardeners that it was going to be replaced the following day anyway. It was not a big deal, but, it's amazing how you can have this confected outrage about things like that sometimes.
You mentioned Maureen Lister, who was Health Minister in Victoria in the Kerner government in the 90s, crying on the steps of Parliament House. I think that was over debate about the closure of Fairfield Hospital. Eventually, of course, Kennett did close that hospital, which provided great care to people with HIV/AIDS. Do you think that closure was the right decision in retrospect? Many people would say no,
James. At
really.
the time I wasn't. I was very much... Well, Maureen gave in at that time and she kept Fairfield open. So, that was successful advocacy and it gave people a little bit better conditions for a couple of years because Fairfield was 50% of the patient load was people with HIV and we were looked at. We were given royal treatment. It was beautiful. We had rooms to ourselves. we had very experienced staff in infectious diseases. It was a stigma-free environment, really, and it was sort of like our own little world away from the rest of the world out there at Fairfield. So look, as long as a couple of extra years, a lot of people would say was very grateful for it. A lot of people felt very grateful for that. But in the long term, I think being at the Alfred's, been necessary. We've had the resources of a large hospital. We managed to get Fairfield House, which is the continuing care unit, set up there. That was part of the deal of the transfer, and that's still there today. It looks after people who need more long-term care. So, yes, I think in the long term, the Alfred's been very responsive to our needs. I sit on some committees there, and people with HIV really do get a say in the way the hospital's run. So, I think in the long term I'd have to say it was for the best, because they weren't going to pour lots of resources into Fairfield, I don't think.
Just going back to the 80s and 90s, tell us about the treatment buyers clubs that existed. And I know some people had rooms full of treatments, all kinds of herbal treatments and weird and wonderful things.
Well, people have to understand that there were no decent treatments at all that doctors could prescribe for HIV until, well, I'd argue that even not really until 1995, but some of the early ones like AZT really did dreadful damage to my body. It's highly debatable whether they help keep me alive, or if, in fact, the dreadful wasting of my arms and legs, of my muscles, and even the fat off my face and so forth, whether that was as much caused by AZT as the virus itself. But it was a combination of both. It wasn't the answer, and a lot of people wouldn't take it, and it actually put them off HIV treatments for some of the better ones that started coming along in the early 90s. They wouldn't take them because they saw what it did to people like me. We were kind of like scarecrows. I hate to say it, but it's true. But, we looked, sunken faces and, skinny bodies. It was a wasting disease, really, and it's a horrible time to remember back to, really.
Absolutely. But of course, it achieved so much social change, and the epidemic has changed so much. And of course, this week we've had Survivors Day, which is a wonderful testament to people like you, David, who have survived and done so much activism for the community that's delivered so much.
Oh, thank you, James.
How would you describe the change that's happened?
Oh, it's monumental. It's life-changing. It's made a huge difference to the big loose groups, like gay men. I'm not saying it's only gay men. We know the epidemic's changing. It's affecting different groups now. But certainly, 70-75% of infections are still with gay men. So it has changed the dynamics in the gay community now to know that your virus is undetectable, meaning you can't pass the virus on. If you are taking your treatments regularly and the virus is undetectable in your blood, which means it's not circulating in your blood, you still have virus hiding away in lymph glands and so forth, and we still need a cure. But it's quite a revolution to think that now I cannot pass that virus on to someone else. That is just the most amazing thing. And on top of that, we're all living pretty much without AIDS. It's very unusual to get a person develop an AIDS-defining illness now because the treatments are so good. They keep illness at bay in most people. Occasionally you'll have someone who doesn't know they're HIV positive, which is why we always argue that people should test, frequently. If they don't know they're positive and then their immune system becomes so weak because the T cells are working away, they're doing their damage and they don't know it, then those people are likely, it could be more likely to develop AIDS. But, even if you get it at the 11th hour, if you get what I'm saying, you can stop it. So really, there's no excuse these days for people not to, if they're, having any kind of risk behaviour, to get tested take treatments as soon as they can if they are positive, because we know that if you delay, you are doing damage to your body in terms of reducing your T cells, which are the marker of your immune system. So, people these days have the tools to prevent HIV. There's a thing called PrEP that people can take now that means that if they have unprotected sex, then they won't get HIV either. It's very unusual for a person to catch it. I mean, some people talk about some people have managed to get HIV regardless, even though they take PrEP, but it's a very tiny percentage. So PrEP is really an important thing to help people prevent it, but for people who have HIV, if they're on treatments, they too can prevent it from being passed on, but their health, the people like me who were at death's door, as you would know, James, you knew me then, were very sick and looked like, we only had months in some cases to live. And when these new treatments came along in the mid-90s, 96, you saw people, they called it the Lazarus syndrome. People were coming back. They came back, their health was restored, they put on weight, and I'm still here.
What was that transition like, going from thinking I'm going to die to actually I'm going to live a bloody long time?
Well, James, I have to be honest, and other people have said this, so I have to, admit it. I was a bit manic. My body was sort of like celebrating. It was like being on champagne the whole time. I felt this incredible restoration in myself, but psychologically I kind of adapted to this low-level coping kind of thing, and as soon as I started to get more energy, and I actually was a bit manic. People used to have to say, David, slow down. And that's something that I saw happen in other people too. It was a kind of like a restoration that almost came too quickly. None of us expected it to be so complete.
David Menadue, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you on 3CR today. Thank you so much.
You too, James. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Okay, bye.
Bye. 3CR.